because of it. Well, we will this morning continue to study the Trinity, the Godhead. We began last week to study the second person of the Godhead. In New Testament Greek, his family name is God. His given name is Jesus, or it's Jesus Theos. Jesus Theos. Recently, Dina and I were doing a little research into her family tree, trying to connect her dad's family directly back to Ireland. That gets to be a little bit of a trick because years ago, Great Britain destroyed most of Ireland's records. So there's this big gap between the 1840s and 1901. A little hard to go from son to father, all the way back. But we figured out you can do it, if not genealogically, you can do it geographically. You can see where these certain given surname or given names are connected to these surnames, and we can narrow it down to one county. Okay, that's where they're from. All these names that still appear in her family, they were back there, still now appearing there together. And it's interesting, if you can't do it genealogically, you can do it geographically. And fortunately for us, in Scripture, we have both the genealogy and the geography, don't we? Geographically, what did we consider last week about Jesus? He was before there was geography, before there was anything to measure and call geography. He was, in fact, he is the reason that there is such a thing. It is through him that God, in fact, made the world. So we have that geographical fact. We also sort of have clear record of his genealogy in more than one way. And so,
I was going to say, yesterday I was talking to a person, and his beliefs was God had to start from somewhere, so there had to be a beginning to God. And tried to explain that to somebody that there's not. God has always been. And you just get so lost in the whole time thing, and trying to figure out, well, God just had to appear. Well, that's really not how it works.
always was.
Yes,
It's fascinating. I do it sometimes just to imagine in the vastness of nothing out there when it was nothing, that he was bigger than all that. Eternally pre-existent, but there are some major religions today that still wrestle with that fact and will still say, yes, he is God, but somewhere he had some parents. He did not. Being spirit. Always was. Yes, sir.
Our mind's so limited, it is hard to grasp that.
Yeah, we can't. You really can't. But, thinking, the reason I brought up doing this little genealogical search about Dina's family, I can go back through all those records and I'll believe somebody I don't know who somewhere had this little scrap of paper and said, this guy was your great-great-great-grandfather. He doesn't know me, I don't know him, there's no way to verify it, but people believe all that. There's a piece of paper that says a man named Jacob Myers was my 7 times great-great-great-great-great-great grandfather who lived in Westphalia, Germany, and fought as a hired mercenary in the American Revolution. He fought for Great Britain, of all things. But anyway, and Jacob Myers never gave a thought to me, but I believe that stuff. Why do we find that so easy? We do. People want to know that stuff. I enjoy knowing that stuff. I know his son fought in the Civil War and all that kind of stuff. But we do, as you say, we're so limited, it's hard to fathom that there was an eternal spirit, is an eternal spirit, before there was self-existent. We talked about that word existent last week. What's it mean when it's not just a reference to time? It's a reference to position. Being eternally self-existent talks about his rank about his power. It talks about his dignity. And we concluded last week, really the premise and the conclusion of last week's class was very simple. That for us, Jesus being the Son of God, Jesus is our everything. That's not a terribly sophisticated way to say it, but he is our everything because God is eminently loving and all of God's promises are true. We wouldn't know anything. We wouldn't know it. How would we know that, Deborah, if there wasn't for Jesus? You wouldn't. You couldn't have a relationship with God the Father if it weren't for Jesus. He is our everything. It is, true that he was eternally existent with God. John 17, verse 5 talks about he was before there was anything, before he was born in the flesh. It says he possessed the glory which he has with God from eternity. So even before the foundation of the world, Jesus, the Son, was rich, exceedingly rich, with all the glory that he had with God. Well, that's all well and fine as a theological matter, but what's important? What makes it important to us? It's what he would do because he was so rich. It's because of what he was willing to do that he became our everything. What was he willing to do? Leave it all behind. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9. My New American Standard Translation says, though he was rich. Just take that phrase. Though he was rich. And when he was in heaven, he determined, at that time he was the Word, he determined that only through making himself poor, making himself impoverished in the weakness of the flesh, that through his life and death, then we might also become rich in glory with God, isn't it? So there he was, the pre-incarnate Word, existent eternally with God. And the only way that he can make that relative, the only way that God can make that relative to us, is that the Word determined to come in flesh. This rich, glorious, beyond imagination, glorious Spirit and Word, there together in heaven. One of them said, well, Word's going to have to go to earth. The Word will have to become flesh. It's interesting that in 2 Corinthians 8 in verse 9, where he determined to become poor. It is an active verb. He determined to become impoverished. And it means even to the point of being destitute. The one who had all things in and of himself, had it all, determined to leave it all behind. And not just leave it behind, but having left it, then would purposely become destitute as a man. It describes him coming to earth, if you go to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 5. I mean, it's not just that he came to earth, but how did he come? How did he enter Jerusalem the Sunday before his crucifixion? In a lowly, lowly form. But he was a lot lower than that, even. Come on, Paul, you can get the pages to work here. Let's get to it. Pages are getting a little old there. Philippians 2 and verse 5. This is Paul's encouragement that we are to imitate Christ. Philippians 2 and verse 5, have this attitude in yourself, which was also in Christ Jesus, although he existed in the form of God. Existed means what? Dignity, rank, privilege, riches. did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped. Come on, Paul. I swear the pages are stuck together. Let me start again. There we go. Verse 6. Although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality of God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself. Active verb. We're not talking just a little bit lacking of anything. He emptied himself of all divine privilege, taking the form of a bondservant. Listen to how he came. Not only came in the flesh, but taking a form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men, lower still, being found in the appearance of the man, he humbled himself, lower still, by becoming obedient, lower still, to the point of death, even death on the cross. I always love the way Paul writes, the way he stacks up those phrases. You can see a progression. It's down, 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 down. And for this reason also then, verse 9. For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name. You see it, exalted, bestowed, above, everything's coming up now. So that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, that every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That same glory where Jesus was before he emptied himself. It's amazing how it works. So Jesus became poor. And when he's on earth, having left that glory of the Father, what did man do? Man did their dead level best to make sure he wouldn't be glorified on earth, didn't they? Deny him, spit on him, curse him, beat him, nail him to a cross, the whole bit. We're going to make sure there's no way, no how that this Jesus is going to be glorified on earth. And in all of that, despite all of that, all of us who have believed in him, now we are the ones who are rich. Why did he impoverish himself? So that spiritually we would become rich. Rich in this promise of an inheritance and all the promises of God. We're rich by our freedom from sin, rich by our hope in heaven. And we best not forget why. It's that passage there in Philippians chapter 2. We are rich because of how low Jesus would go so that God would exalt him, and with him we would be exalted. What's the attitude of Christ there in that passage in Philippians that we're to imitate? The attitude of servitude. He came as a bondservant. And not just as a bondservant, how low would he go? All the way. All the way. Why? It's why, as man, we dare not think that equality with God is something to be grasped. Why didn't Jesus think equality with God was something to be grasped? After he had determined to leave it all behind, as a man then to turn around, remembering he's fully human, as a fully human man to turn around and grasp at that's sin, isn't it? What did the devil want Jesus to do in the wilderness? You're hungry, Jesus. You've been suffering for 40 days. Yes, you left all that privilege behind, but come on, you know Jesus. You can call on it. You can turn these stones into bread. For Jesus to have done so would have been sin, because he would be grasping power that he had purposely determined and committed to leave behind. Well, come on, Jesus, look all the way around you here. Everything you can see, as far as you can see, Jesus, you can have it. Since you remember, Jesus, you created it. So go ahead and take it. Why did he not grasp the power of God? That would be sin. Well, Jesus, you can go up to the top of the temple and we can throw you down to the ground, but you can save yourself. Why didn't he do it? Be sin. He gave all that up. He's emptied of all that. That's really what it means to be fully human. He's fully God and fully human. But what's fully human? Powerless. Powerless on his own. Not having that rank or privilege or that glory. It's an example that the Son must be 100% dependent upon the Father. As we ought to be. He's got to be dependent upon the Father's perfect will. He's got to be dependent on the Father's provision and protection completely. Because if Jesus, the fully human person, is ever going to be exalted, there's only one person who can do it. The Father. And so he's utterly dependent. From the day that God breathed life into our souls, what ought we to understand? We ought never dare to think that we are anywhere, anything close to reaching up and having of our own worth any glory or riches of God. But what happened there in the garden? What has man proven that we want to do? We want to take knowledge to ourselves. We want to control our own life. Adam and Eve thought, man, we can determine all this for ourselves. We can be seen as wise. We can be glorified as ourselves being wise. No, you can't. No, you can't. That's why Jesus laid all this aside, why he intentionally impoverished himself as an example for us. Well, there is no way that we ought to presume ourselves anywhere near to an equal of God. How many people do so? How many religions even say so? Utter foolishness. And so, having forgone all divine privilege, really the Father is Jesus' only hope for heaven, isn't it? And that's only by Jesus' obedience to do what the Father wills and to accomplish the work that the Father sent him to do. And again, that's my best definition for being fully human. What is our only hope of ever being exalted in heaven? Same thing. To do the will of the Father, to accomplish the work we're given to do, to know that we're fully dependent upon him from the time that he breathed life into us, for his provision, for his protection, all that goes for the promise, all of it. What's the example Jesus is setting? Take yourself down. You know, when we talk about being impoverished, he took on the lowest form of a bondservant. He's owned by another. He serves the will of another. He doesn't even dare to speak for himself. He's susceptible to all the sicknesses of men, to all the temptations of men. Why do you have to do it? Theologically, why do you have to do it? Because you can't crucify an eternal spirit God in heaven. He had to live in likeness of a man. Since the shedding of blood is the only remedy for sin, and the Spirit God doesn't have any, the Word had to become blood. And so he humbled himself to do that. I was thinking about, we talk about being humbled, what do we usually think of? We'd like to see somebody taken down a notch or two. Let's take some peg. I think a couple of your brothers have a neighbor named Mary Ann you'd like to be taken down a peg or two, you know. And we'd think, well, we'd like to see somebody have a little slice of humble pie. But that's not this. That's not at all this. Jesus went from an absolute position of perfect glory and privilege, being humiliated to utter destitution. And if he hadn't been, we wouldn't have any hope at all, would we, Roger?
That's right.
Wouldn't have any at all. It's all because of the shedding of his blood. And again, as you alluded to earlier, Tawny, it's even hard for people to fathom such a thing. That there was in the beginning this early eternal spirit, and there was with God this eternal word. And the two decided there's going to be a distinction between us, and the word is going to have to take on bodily form and dwell among men, yes, being fully God, but also fully human. Having left all the privilege of God, but being willing to die as the lowest form of man. Why? Because it's the only way to satisfy the Word. It's the only way to satisfy the Word. Yes, sir.
So part of that being destitute, there's two extremes here. It's destitute, and then somebody that has it all.
Yeah.
That has it all, they tend to rely on themselves,
Mm-hmm.
pump themselves up. But you can be so destitute that, I want what you have. It's a dangerous thing too.
Sure.
And you got it, I want it, I'm going to get it.
Everybody owes me that. Yeah.
Right, and you see that today, but Jesus was able to overcome that. And so, that's from one extreme to the other, and they're both can be very bad.
He never, as being fully human, he never did take anything, did he, that wasn't provided for him by God?
He trusted God.
How did he send out his disciples? With only the clothes on their back. You don't take any money with you. You don't take any food with you. You just go. And along the way, you don't try to, take things from others. You don't try to grasp power that's not your own. You just go. And trust him. That's the example. And so the Logos became Word. Let's go then to Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2. Why is the letter to the Hebrews written? What's the problem with those Hebrew Christians who had been scripturally born again?
They're trying to go back to the Jewish ways of worship because they don't.
Why do they want to go back? They're not sure the sacrifice of Christ was enough. They're not sure his example was quite pure enough, or that his sacrifice was quite enough to get it all done. Men are trying by their own will to sort of hedge the bet. Here's the one who made the world, one who has done everything according to the eternal word, lived it perfectly as the example, fulfilled it completely. They believed it for a time, but now the world is saying something else to them. Just like the world says something else to us today. Okay, yeah, but can you really believe that, Deborah? Come on now, can you really believe that, Deborah? You know what you were. We all do. Hopefully we all do. I know what I was. Can I trust this? Jeff, can you trust the sacrifice of Jesus' blood? All the way? All the way? You don't need to hedge your bet? That's what they're trying to do. But look at the foolishness of that. Hebrews chapter 2, let's begin in verse 10. Why did all this to be? It was fitting for him. Why is it fitting? Because the word fitted is fitted for this. It was fitting for him, for whom are all things, and through whom are all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to perfect the author of their salvation through suffering. For both he who sanctifies, that sets us apart from the world, and those who are sanctified, that is, separated from their sin, are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. saying, I will proclaim your name to my brethren. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children whom God has given me. This is Jesus' very own words from his prayer in John 17. I and the children whom God has given me. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, being in bodily form just as Jesus was, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. So Jesus not only came as the flesh, he humbled himself as a bondservant, keeps taking himself lower and lower, the least and the least, to be one who would not take any power, any claim of power, not even to defend himself when he's going to the cross, go all the way down so that we might be called his brothers. How is it the love of God became relative to us? Because Jesus was 100% fully human, fully dependent upon God's protection, God's provision, God's plan, God's promises, all of it. And for these Hebrews who had believed in that, but then began to think, I'm not sure that's quite enough. What's God's response to that? Well, one response is this letter. But for them to have known the promise, to have received the promise, and then to reject it, that's why the scripture says perhaps they'd have been better off never to know it, isn't it? They share this in common with Jesus, this existence in body and blood, in taking on the same, taking on the same. It's another one of those phrases that reminds us that he eternally was with God. But why would he, taking on the same, give his flesh to be nailed to the cross and give his very last drop of blood? I mean, it washed whatever blood was remaining washed out with the water. I mean, he was empty. Because no one but God could and would make the perfectly pure sacrifice for our sin. Isn't that amazing? Now, you want to talk about things that are hard to fathom? That's it. That no one but God, whom man sinned against, is going to also be willing to turn around and give of himself to pay the price for our sin. That's amazing. And so you've got these Hebrews, some of them want to go back to Judaism, others would go back and believe in idols. Well, let's believe in Jesus, we'll also worship this idol, we're going to be hedging our bet a little bit. No. Utter, not just faithlessness, it's lunacy. The eternal, the pre-incarnate Word requires the price of a spotless animal shedding its innocent blood. And so by Jesus' coming, it is the only way to fulfill the Word, isn't it? The only way. And it's amazing that God would himself pay the price for the sins that we commit against him. What's been the theme of the Bible from the beginning? Particularly for people who want to worship another God or presume that there's some other way than through Jesus. What's been the theme from the beginning? There is no other God. There is no other God who would do such a thing, who has the plan, the love, the purpose, the means to do such a thing. So why do people trust something else? I mean, it goes again to what I mentioned about genealogy stuff. People find it so easy. Oh, there's a record back there somewhere that somebody did such and such. I don't have any way of proving it. There's no proof of it. But we have record, we have proof that more than 500 people saw Jesus at the same time, resurrected from the dead to new life. We know all of this. It's true. And so Jesus became flesh. So flesh would satisfy the Word. Isn't that interesting? The Word became flesh so that as flesh, he could satisfy the Word. It's amazing. Yes, Lord. Well, in the same way, yeah. You know, there is no genealogy for those generations. And yet they still want to depend upon that, don't they? Well, that's not what you need to depend upon. Yes, sir.
But the whole Mosaical law was based on physical activities up to
Mm-hmm.
then, and then when Christ came, the church became spiritual.
Right.
And they're having a hard time grasping the spirituality of the church, and so they keep going back to their old ways, and that's...
Well, it's that whole thing still. How do you fathom this thing?
It's got to be hard to under pressure. You kind of go back to what you know, even though it was wrong. But I think that's part of their problem. They're looking for something physical that they can tangibly rely on. But you're right, that's definitely wrong.
It's just amazing to think, okay, here's the eternal Spirit God. Eternally with him is this Word. And this Word reveals God, also reveals the requirements of God. And God, knowing that man would commit sin against him, had already, from before eternity, said, okay, this Word that is with me is going to dwell among men as flesh, and doing so as flesh will be crucified to satisfy the Word that was with God. Yeah, it's a little hard to fathom. But it's true, isn't it? It's true.
It would be a good question to ask people that are non-believers who died for their sins.
Even before that, who would be willing to?
Yeah. And that's what I'm
Who'd be
trying
willing to?
get at.
Well, we got just a couple of minutes. Let's draw some conclusions here. We know from the last 2 weeks that Jesus was eternally existing with God before the world was. He had all that rank and privilege and dignity and all that glory. And again, this Word existed is not just a matter of time. It is most especially about his privileged position. But that Word was not only willing, but determined to come to the world. Determined to. And the word determined, think about it, even the Word even determined the name that Jesus would be given at birth, didn't it? What did the angel say to Mary? And this child shall be named Jesus. That's a requirement of the Word. And so, this name also determines that he's going to be submissive. He's going to take the place of utter subjection. And Jesus, Jesus, when he teaches men who will believe in him, he's really talking about, in believing, those who will trust God, those who will trust God's power, trust God's plan, and God's power to bring about his plan. And so he asks us to trust the word of the testimony, because Jesus is the testimony, isn't he? They're the same. Here's the word that testified of the Jesus who is to come. Jesus in the flesh is the testimony of what? The Word. And so it is that what, in a sense, what comes down will be raised up. What you pondering, brother?
Well, I was just thinking, as we can look at it now and see the picture from the beginning to Christ's death.
Yep.
And I think we need to also remember that as much as all that was planned out from the beginning, so is the end that we're living in right now. God is still in control in the exact same way. And that's
You know, and again, people are grasping at all kinds of things, aren't they? What do we not really grasp, but what ought we already to hold? The assurance of God's provision, His protection, His promise, His power. You know, we read, I keep going back recently to Romans chapter 5, and all those blessings that we have because we've been justified by faith. That's that assurance of all that. His protection, His provision, His power, His promises are sure. And so, even though we have not personally seen the Father or the Son, we trust the historical documents. I mentioned earlier, we've got a genealogical record, we've got a geographical record. There's think about how Peter talks about it. We can verify all things according to the words of the Old Testament prophets, the commands of Jesus, and those things taught to us by the apostles. And every bit of that is satisfied by Jesus having come to earth, having humbled Himself even to the point of death. He was in that situation just as we are, isn't He? Are you entirely dependent upon God's promise? I mean, if you're going to, at the end of this life, if you don't fear death, it's because you're entirely dependent on what? God's promises, His provision, His protection, His promises, His power to do all that He has said. That's why Jesus didn't grasp equality with God. Because neither can we. We're all dependent on Him, totally. It's a marvelous truth in what sounds like just simple theology. Well, He came to earth. Well, why did He do it? What did He accomplish? Well, certainly He is the example we are to follow as well. Hope it's worthwhile to you to consider these things.